very much, Sean. Now I would like to give the floor to Barbara Junisbai discussing democratic attitudes in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan.
Okay, hello everyone. So I think it's interesting that I follow Sean because Sean's talking about large-scale regime issues and the leadership decisions that have to be made, and I'm going to switch and talk about how I think that sort of broader context affects or is reflected in public opinion, right? So shifting a little bit to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan from Uzbekistan. So this is my first, this is my second Polnars event. Earlier in the summer, I got to go to Kharkiv for the regional conference, and I'm here for the annual conference. It's my great pleasure to be here and to share the results of a project that I'm working with my two co-authors. So I look forward to your feedback. All right, so the question that I'm interested in, can you hear me? The question that we're interested in is the question of where do democratic values come from? How and what causes democratic values? So there's a large literature that says that people's attitudes, their political attitudes, their values come out of the context in which they live. But how different scholars have different ways of defining that context, right? So for a group of scholars, the important context is the regime type. Right? So is it a democracy? Democracies offer citizens the opportunity to practice democracy, right? So they learn democratic values or attitudes by participating in democratic procedures and processes, by voting. They are socialized into democracy. And in authoritarian regimes, the converse would say that citizens then sort of get authoritarian norms, right, or values. They learn those through the context in which they live. That's sort of a very concrete and kind of narrow description of context. Another set of authors sort of broadly frame context as the prevailing historical circumstances, the political climate, the larger political environment. And so there's this sort of question that these two different streams or approaches of looking at context raise. And that question is, well, what is context and when does it matter? What kind of context matters? Especially when we think about political regimes. There's no pure democracy, just like there's no pure authoritarian regime, right? So different regimes can have different components can combine different components that might not necessarily neatly fit together. And so this is the question that our research tries to explore. Okay. So zooming down, all right. So I've chosen these two countries. We've chosen Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. We conducted a survey in 2012, 2 years after the change in the constitution in Kyrgyzstan that shifted it from a presidential system to a mixed parliamentary presidential system. And what we wanted to know is, does this change in system of government, right? And does the difference in between Kyrgyzstan's sort of political context as being more free, according to Polity 4, being a democracy in 2012, right? Versus Kazakhstan's presidential system, Freedom House calling it not free, and Polity 4 saying that it's an autocracy. If we see these two different regime types, right, overall, or these two different political contexts, do we then see a concomitant difference in support for democracy? And so you might note that the title of my presentation it has the word ardent Democrats. So in our study, what we're looking at is people who strongly agree with or strongly support certain democratic principles that are exhibited in the survey questions that we ask. Okay, all right, so one working hypothesis, right, before I show you the data, is that there should be ardent Democrats or strong supporters of democracy, if we look at political context in terms of regime type, should probably be more prevalent in Kyrgyzstan than in Kazakhstan, right? If I just follow that basic logic that I've taken from the scholarship. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so what do we find? Oh, I'm sorry, here's the questions. Here are the questions that we ask. So we asked a whole bunch of, included a lot of different questions about support for democracy in our survey, but I'm just going to focus on these 4 because it would be too much, right? So let's talk for a moment about the kind of society you'd like to have in this country. Please tell me how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. Citizens should be more active in questioning the actions of leaders. Since leaders represent everyone, they should not favor their own family or group. Opposition parties should regularly examine and criticize government policies and actions. And the news media should constantly investigate and report on corruption and the mistakes made by government. So these are pretty concrete, specific things, right? They're not broad questions. We did include questions like, it's important for me to live in a democratic country, or honest elections are good for my family's financial well-being, those kinds of questions, but I'm not looking at them here. So these are very specific kinds of questions, right? And here's what we found. So our analysis is 2 stages. The first stage is just the percentages, right? So if you look broadly at the percentages, the second and third column, actually Kazakhstanis are more likely to be ardent Democrats. There are more ardent Democrats as percentage of the population in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And that we didn't expect to find, right? If we use the basic sort of outline of, not theory, but sort of the expectations, the predictions that came out of that literature, okay? And also the other thing to note is that the country differences really aren't that big. Even though they're statistically significant, the differences are just like less than 6%, right? They range from 4 to about 6%. So the differences aren't really that big, right? So we don't actually see that strong reflection in public opinion that some literature might have suggested. Okay, so there are different ways to interpret this, right? So what are the reasons for it? Well, there's been a few studies that show that actually public opinion or people's responses to questions about democracy in authoritarian contexts show that people in authoritarian regimes are more likely to support democracy than people in democracies, right? And that makes sense because democracy is messy. You don't always get what you want, especially in Kyrgyzstan. Their form of democracy, if that's what we want to call it, it can be quite messy, right? And often they also say that if you don't have something, then you want it, right? You appreciate what you don't have. You don't necessarily appreciate what you do have. So that's one explanation. The other thing that I think is interesting is this third question, right? Strongly agree that leaders should not favor their own family or group. The results for Kyrgyzstan, that only 31% of people questioned or queried strongly agree with the statement, really surprised us, because they say, a lot of people's understanding of the 2 revolutions that Kyrgyzstan had, right, in 2005 and 2010, say that people's dissatisfaction were actually rooted in nepotism and corruption, that people were really dissatisfied with those things. So we would expect that people would have much stronger feelings against nepotism, but we see actually that people don't have it to the degree that we expected, right? All right, so if the differences between the 2 countries are really not that great, we want to look at who is likely, right? Who is more likely in society to support to strongly support democracy. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, right, so all of the things that we included in here are things from other studies, basically, and a lot of things that are cleavage-based, right, like different groups, like people who have more education, people who have less education, people who live in cities versus people who live in rural areas, people who are religious by saying that they pray daily or that they identify as religious. These things actually don't really matter that much. And I forgot to include our R-squared, but it's very small, right? So the things that have been found to be important in sort of having people tend more towards supporting democracy don't work here, right? People who use the internet for information, they're not more likely than people who don't use the internet for information. Wealthier people, men, all of these things, they don't really matter that much. But the one thing that we did find was so interesting, if you look at the bottom, youth, right? So youth in Kazakhstan are much less likely than people 30 years and older to support any of the 4 or 3 statements that were statistically significant. Not only are youth in Kazakhstan less likely to strongly agree with those statements, but youth in Kazakhstan, this plus, indicates that there's a statistically significant difference between responses in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Right? So there's not really a difference between young people in Kyrgyzstan in terms of their support for democracy. But there is a difference in Kazakhstan, and the difference between the 2 countries is statistically significant. All right, so what does that say? I think that's our most interesting finding. So although the populations in both countries, the proportion of the population in both countries that strongly support democracy are relatively low, about 30%, right? In Kazakhstan, young people are far less likely to support specific kinds of practices, right, that are associated with democracy. But in Kyrgyzstan, there's really no difference between young people and older people. All right, so that finding tells us that in Kazakhstan there might be a trend, right, where people who are younger, who are being socialized under the current regime, actually maybe are imbibing or sort of being are reflecting the regime's values back out. So if we look at the questions, leaders should not favor their own group. Well, in Kazakhstan, the regime, the presidential system, the patronage system actually is built in a way that leaders do favor their own group. So it makes sense that younger people in Kazakhstan would actually say that that's okay because that's the system under which they live. Citizens should be more active in questioning government. Well, citizens in Kazakhstan aren't really active in questioning government for a variety of reasons. And so I think that young people reflect this attitude as well, and this value and this reality. Media should constantly report on government corruption. Younger Kazakhstanis are less likely than older Kazakhstanis to agree with this statement. And that's partly because the media doesn't do those things, right? So one of our interpretations of this finding that really surprised us is that in Kazakhstan, young people, what we call the Nazarbayev generation, that they really internalized and reflect out the values that their government shares, right, or projects through its actions and its practices. The other thing that's interesting, I forgot what I was going to say. The other thing that's interesting is we don't see that same thing in Kyrgyzstan as we see in Kazakhstan. So one of the things that we're thinking as our working hypothesis, is that in Kyrgyzstan the regime, right, has a mix of different components. It has informal practices that are still holdovers from before the constitutional reform, but it had until recently these democratic aspirations that are embodied in the constitution. So that kind of sends mixed signals to people, right? And people may be even more cynical about democracy. Whereas in Kazakhstan, the informal rules about who gets what, how, when, why, all those things, that matches really closely with actually what's enshrined in the constitution and what's been enshrined in practice since Kazakhstan gained its independence, right, in 1991. So that sort of meshing of things that's more closely connected sends a really clear signal to the people who grew up after the collapse of the Soviet Union, who went to school, college, university, high school, all those things after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so this result, although to us pessimistic, is also quite interesting in thinking about what is context. What is political context? When does it matter? Under what conditions? What factors in context are more important? So that's all I wanted to share with you today, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions, and also I know there are other kinds of things we can think about, right? So if you think about it from a modernism perspective, a modernization perspective, then it makes sense that none of these things, these cleavages matter because both countries are economically not developed, right? So in modernization theory, the assumption is that as the economy becomes more modernized and as there's a middle class developing, these different cleavages start to matter, and we don't see that here. So that might be one of the reasons why there are no effects on those things. Again, but so just keep this one in mind because it's very interesting. All right, thank you so much.